Welcome once again to the Link Online. And here we are live on Facebook and live on the RCI Net website at this time, Fridays, 16:15 hours GMT or 1:15 here in the eastern part of the Canada, the central eastern part of Canada, more or less, because the eastern side has a different time zone entirely.
Two different time zones.
Two different time zones. Actually, it's a time zone and a half.
Yes, right? That's right.
I'm Mark Montgomery. Welcome to the program once again. I'm here with Carmel Kilkenny.
Hello. Nice to be here.
And Terry Haig.
Hey, Mark.
And back with us from World Travels once again on keyboards and multitasking all kinds of things, Marie-Claude Simard.
Hi, everybody.
And, of course, on the other side of the control room, we have Chantal Saint-Sauveur. And deep in the background, our overseeing angel, Pierre Dutil. He's in charge of shipping and receiving, all technological
right
and logistic solutions, and psychological counseling for the staff here at
Shipping and receiving all of us.
He's going to the top.
Hair and makeup as well. All right, coming up this half hour, Carmel.
Well, I have an elegant explanation of one of the major points of contention in the ongoing NAFTA trade talks with the United States. Chapter 19, what it does and why it's so important to Canada.
All right, Terry.
And I'll tell you about school lunches in Canada or the lack of them.
Okay, and I'll be speaking to a scientist who has new information about the fate of the lost Franklin expedition to the Arctic in 1845. Those are some of the stories coming up, along with some of your comments to our various stories on this edition of The Link Online. All right, NAFTA, big in the news in Canada, perhaps not so much in the United States or in Mexico.
Maybe not today. Things have changed in the United States in the last couple of days.
Now, we had a deadline. President Trump was going, you got to get a deal by Friday, the 31st of August, or the whole thing's off. And that deadline came and went, and they're still
last Friday.
Negotiating. What's going on?
Well, the negotiations for this North American Free Trade Agreement, it's in the high-stakes final stage for sure between Canada and the United States, because Mexico already came to some sort of deal with the United States. The effort to update and modernize this 25-year-old trilateral agreement has been going on now for about over a year. President Donald Trump, of course, campaigned on tearing up the agreement, you may remember, which he maintains has taken advantage of the United States. And, of course, not everyone agrees with that view. Mexico, as I said, came to an agreement with the United States. Now it remains to be seen if we can actually do the same. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has repeatedly said no deal is better than a bad deal for Canada. One of the major challenges is what's known as Chapter 19 in the current agreement. The U.S. wants to abolish it and deal with any trade disputes that take place between the three countries in American courts. Canada is totally against this development. Derek Burney was Canada's ambassador to the United States from 1989 until 1993, and he was one of the chief negotiators of the original free trade agreement with the U.S. Earlier this week, he was a guest on the CBC News Network, and he explained why this matters.
The purpose of Chapter 19 is to enable any of the parties to challenge the application of trade law by one of the other parties. What does that mean? It means that if we're unhappy that the U.S. trade tribunals are ruling against Canadian exporters in a way that's inconsistent with their own laws, we can challenge that decision. We lived with many of those, we call those decisions either arbitrary or capricious, but they're not in accordance with their own law. We lived with that in the 1980s. We were hit time after time with duties by the Americans on various kinds of Canadian exports. So it became the sine qua non for us to say, okay, we're going to lower our tariffs, which were higher than the Americans, but in exchange for doing all of that, we need something to temper the power imbalance between countries, that one of which is 10 times the size of the other. We wanted a way to check the flawed implementation of U.S. trade law. And so the dispute settlement panels that were set up under Chapter 19, that's their purpose. If a country feels aggrieved by the manner in which U.S. trade law is being used, as we often do feel, we can invoke the dispute settlement panel. It became important to the point that the WTO, which followed the initial FTA, emulated the same concept. It was reinforced by NAFTA in the sense that it was made permanent in NAFTA. It was temporary in the FTA because we thought we could come up with a better definition of anti-dumping and countervail the illegitimate trade actions. We weren't able to do that. So it was made permanent. And it's been emulated in other trade agreements. So it's not novel, nor is it foolproof. We have won many times before dispute settlement tribunals on things like softwood lumber, on pork. The pork producers of Canada would tell you that it's been very beneficial to them. We even won on the meat labeling legislation that the U.S. Congress tried to invoke a few years ago to discriminate against Canadian products in their market from American. It's not foolproof. The Americans, being American, always try to find ways to get around a ruling that goes against them. But we've managed to stick to our guns and ensure that it stays in place.
There we go. That was Derek Burney, former ambassador, Canadian ambassador to the United States, and one of the original negotiators of that FTA agreement, the original free trade agreement. And you heard him saying the Americans being Americans. It's interesting how the rhetoric is kind of heating up over all of this. Yeah. But still, as we sit here on Friday, September 7th, no agreement has been announced. We hear lots of talk of cordial meetings and negotiations moving along in good faith, et cetera, but,
well, one wonders, I mean, as you said at the beginning, there is a tentative sort of agreement between the United States and Mexico. And one wonders what kind of sort of Chapter 19 type of deal they've worked out, because they're keeping everything secret.
Well, that's it. There's no text has been revealed. But yeah. Derek Burney went on in this interview to say, there's rumors of side notes, etc., and that does not necessarily bode well. So it's understandably, it's difficult. It's a big lurching phenomenon, but it's better to have an agreement than no agreement.
Well, the other aspect of this, of course, is that Chapter 19 is in place, but that really hasn't stopped years and years of litigation about softwood lumber, which he mentioned, and the meat labeling thing, which went to the WTO. And you have Chapter 19. The Americans disagreed with that. It took it to the WTO.
But at least it's a process. Whereas if you go into American courts, imagine Canada and Mexico going into American courts to argue. It's just we've lost not the same thing at all.
Well, with the free trade agreement, Canada has lost so many other court decisions. I think it's Chapter 11, the investor-state dispute mechanism, where the Americans can sue if they think they're not their profits have been harmed by Canadian legislation.
That's in all trade agreements, and we've got lots of those. But we're not going to go into that today.
Right. Lots more to come on the program. Well, the summer holidays in North America are over. The school buses are back out delivering and picking up children, and the public transit systems are full of people as well now. School is back in session across Canada. And Terry, you did a story about kind of a long-standing battle connected with school children, not older kids necessarily, but school children.
Yeah, it's kind of strange, Mark, that Canada, this country that prides itself on compassion and generosity, or at least says it does, has thousands of kids going to school every day lacking the nutrition they need to concentrate on their studies, either in class or when they go home. Now check out this fact. Check it out. In a report published last year, UNICEF ranked Canada 37th out of 41 OECD countries, that's wealthy countries, on access to nutritious food for children. 37 out of 41.
That is surprising, yeah.
Yes. Anyway, all right. There have been calls since 1997 for a national lunch program. So far, nada. I spoke to Professor at Dalhousie University in Halifax about it. Her name is Sarah Kirk, and she is a longtime advocate on the issue. And she and Amberly T. Ruetz of the University of Guelph wrote an article in the Huffington Post entitled "The Case for Giving Canadian Kids Free Meals at School." So I asked her, quoting Andy Kim, how did things ever get this way?
Yeah, It's frustrating for sure, because Canada is actually one of the only OECD countries that does not have a national school food program. We rank 37th out of 41 on a recent report from UNICEF around provision of school food, and so we're in a, I think it's a bit embarrassing, to be honest, that we have not been having this conversation, or that we've been having the conversation but not actually acting on it. There's a number of reasons for that. The first is that it's political will needs to be there, and people need to recognize that this is an issue for our kids, that too many of our kids are going to school hungry, too many of our kids are not getting the best start in life to help them to achieve good prosperity in the future. And there's also an issue of jurisdiction. So education is a provincial or territorial jurisdiction, and so the most recent call from Senator Art Eggleton talks about a national food program for children and youth. It doesn't actually relate specifically to school food. However, we know that kids spend a lot of their day in school, so therefore that makes it a really important setting. It's a protected space where children go to learn. Where better to learn about health and well-being than in the school environment?
Do we have any data on how many children go to school not properly, without the proper nutrition every day in Canada? I know, because it's probably hard to find that data because everything is provincial, but do you guys have anything on that?
Yeah. So the data tends to be done on a province by province basis, but certainly my own research, we found a quarter of kids are going to school hungry in the province of Nova Scotia, and that is slightly higher in some parts of the country, slightly lower in other parts of the country. So it's not consistent across the country, but any child going to school hungry is a problem as far as I'm concerned, and I think that's what we have to focus on, is that there are multiple reasons why kids go to school hungry. It's not just because it's not because parents don't care. Of course, parents care, but we have the issue of healthy food tends to be more expensive. We have an environment that actually undermines healthy behaviors for all of us, not just our children. And there's a lack of understanding what even is healthy food and what do these things mean. So we need to be looking at this as a there's a strong evidence that if we support nutrition in children, then that does have outcomes that will impact the rest of their life. They'll have lower rates of chronic disease when they're growing, as they age, and which at the moment, cost of diet-related chronic diseases in Canada is around $190 billion each year. So we're paying for this in some way, albeit not the way that it should be, if you like.
Now, as part of my conversation with Professor Sarah Kirk, she's a professor of health promotion and the scientific director of the Healthy Populations Institute at Dalhousie University in Halifax.
Well, I wonder how that would work if kids went to school and got lunch given to them at school, because you'd have to have a cafeteria. You'd have to have a kitchen or something, wouldn't you? Which would be hugely expensive. And you have to have staff and inspectors and everything else. I just don't know. School boards don't seem to have any money for that kind of thing anymore.
What, you don't have the money to feed your kids at school? So, I don't
know how it would work, because...
Don't all schools have cafeterias?
Well, remember, it evolved. We used to go home for school.
Yeah.
When I was a kid going to school.
For lunch, you mean? Yeah.
For lunch, yeah.
What did I say? We used to go home for school. No, we went home for lunch, yes.
Oh, okay, because we had cafeterias where I went to school.
Yeah, well, they did at one point, but
they don't have them anymore.
Not in most of the schools that I know.
The majority of schools that were built in the sort of the big bulge of the baby boomers in Canada, the 50s and 60s, there were no cafeterias in them because the kids all went home for lunch.
Or they brought their lunch to school in
mothers were at home.
Really?
Yeah, and the children walked to school back and forth.
Now here's in my school when I was a kid's school, I walked home for lunch because we had an hour, and it was about 10 minutes walk away, or now it would be considered like an hour, but back then a kilometer was nothing for a kid to walk.
Well, it depended how long it took you too. If you had to go through fields and pick some flowers.
Yeah. Anyway, but in high school, people would bring their bagged lunches, and it always shocked me because at lunchtime, all these people would take their healthy bagged lunch that Mom had prepared with apples and bananas and sandwiches and stuff, and toss it and bin them. and go out to the fast food joint and buy French fries and burgers. And I thought, well, that's crazy. If the parents could see garbage cans full of quality food.
Something tells me 14 and 15-year-olds haven't changed a bit.
What was the case in your school? I mean, when you were going to I guess, grade 9 kind of thing, junior high sort of thing?
I used to walk home too, but when I had my kids and they were little, there were a lot of problems about kids eating at school because if they have a lunch, we still have to pay for the supervision, which is very expensive.
Yes.
And if you have like 3 kids in the same school, it could be over $1,000.
Oh, wow.
And if you want to have your kid come home to eat, then you have to pay for that the transportation, the bus, the school bus, that extra school bus for the lunch. So you never
paying.
Win. Yeah. You're always paying. And when you have a big family,
well, that's another thing, because we used to walk home. Kids, I don't think they're even allowed to do that anymore, are they?
Well, it depends. I mean, if they get to grade 4 or 5, they're walking home.
Wow.
And the other thing, of course, is that if you had a cafeteria serving national lunches, you have to be extremely careful nowadays about allergies. Right? There was no such thing as peanut allergy when I went to school. I never heard of it. My whole generation grew up on peanut butter sandwiches.
That was the lunch.
That was the lunch. Yeah.
Well, here's an interesting stat I saw the other day in the Harper's Index. The thing they have, crazy stats they have in Harper's magazine. Excuse me. You know how many in the United States? This is the United States. How many teachers shell out of their own pocket to buy school supplies?
Oh, yeah. They do it here, too.
Something like 94% of teachers. And you know what else? Their salaries are going down.
Yeah.
What? I mean, what is it? What does that tell us about a society?
Well, I mean, that's an interesting point, because when I went to grade school, the little scribblers were furnished.
Yes, in Ontario, everything was supplied. I always loved the first day of school when you got all that stuff. But again, it's the erosion of our tax dollars. They just don't go as far.
Yeah.
Well, because there's too many bureaucrats?
And it's the evolution of family life and society in Canada.
Anyway, it's a point of discussion. If you have any thoughts, drop us a line. And speaking of that, we have some comments to stories that you have posted. And we continue to get a lot of feedback to our story about the valsartan situation, the heart drug valsartan. We won't get into them this week because they're all pretty much the same as what we said before. But I do suggest that if you want to get involved with, because many say they want to put me on the class action list. If you want to get involved in the class action, you have to go to the legal company that has initiated that. We can't do anything. We just tell the story. You have to get in touch with the company that is mentioned in the story that is launching the class action lawsuit. All right, so let's move on now. And this week to the story about Rohingya, and a story that the Prime Minister's office says Canada must stay engaged with Myanmar leader Aung San Suu Kyi. Peter Ashcroft wrote this.
Our buddy Peter Ashcroft. It's ironic, writes Peter, that these 2 journalists published known facts that the Myanmar-Burma rulers tried to suppress. I believe that Aung San Suu Kyi is technically a prisoner of this military dictatorship where truth is an irrelevance.
All right. On a story that Canada's children face deep-rooted problems, Rod had this opinion.
Is it any wonder? You can blame much of it on the gender confusion movement. When a 5-year-old is told they're not the boy or girl they were born as, what do you think that does to a child's mental health? Until some grown-up hits them with the news that because Johnny sometimes plays with girls' toys or Becky climbs trees and prefers to play with boys, that there's something wrong with them. How does that affect the mind of a little kid? Having to deal with sexuality when they should be just playing like 5-year-olds do, not contemplating their sexuality. Of course, they're going to grow up confused, mentally unhealthy. You wait, this is just the tip of the iceberg. In decades, there will be more adults with mental health problems than there ever has been.
All right, and on the same story, but it's slightly different aspect, Harry wrote this.
I don't have it.
Children need nutritious food to survive. Food retailers are doing everything possible that customers don't get access to healthy, nutritious foods by jacking the prices so high that only the greedy rich have access to them. Some food retailing managers need to be put in jail for price fixing and corruption.
All right.
Good move there. I like the way you did the one page. It's on both sides. That's good. Okay, I didn't see that, Montgomery. Let's keep them guessing.
We're saving paper.
Thank you very much.
Yes,
Carm,
we're
for
saving.
Jumping in. Now, should I do you?
Yes, go ahead.
Oh, wait, let me do the introduction.
Okay, do the intro, please, Mark.
With that diplomatic spat between Canada and Saudi Arabia, in which Saudi students here were recalled by Saudi Arabia, we have a story that says some would seek asylum in order to stay here. And James B. wrote this.
It is amazing how many Saudi students are in Canada. On the other hand, Canada needs doctors, engineers, and scientists to help the Canadian economy. Not many people want to live in Canada.
I'm not sure.
No, I would not agree with that. Lots of people want to live in Canada.
Hey, back off, buddy.
And several of the Saudi students are applying to stay.
Well, yeah,
lots of them are.
But he is correct. It is really surprising the number of Saudi students that are here in Canada, and a lot of them are but resident doctors, doing their residency here. And when that Saudi order came through that you guys have to leave and come back, the hospitals were like freaking out because, they have these people on staff basically. And without these young doctors, they were really going to hurt badly. So, Canadians were going to hurt badly,
One of the great sights in Montreal, and I'm sure you've all seen it, you go to any hospital here in Montreal, you see the old Jewish guy, the doctor, shepherding around a kid from the Middle East, an intern from the Middle East. It's so cool to see, actually, teaching them. It's wonderful.
All right, let's move on. We had a couple more comments on the story the federal government is thinking of banning handguns. Henry Cousineau wrote this.
You have to be naive to think that the gun control bill C-71 will reduce gun crimes. Criminals don't follow the rules.
All right, and as we get towards the end, a couple of tongue-in-cheek responses to a story about gender-neutral option on another federal government form. John wrote,
I identify as a hippopotamus. Will I have that option on the next census form?
And on the same story from Red Wagon.
Okay, I'll play their game, but only for a few moments. What would they do if I were to declare myself gender neutral because I identify as an electron, therefore invisible? How would they identify me and have me pay my bills and taxes? All together now, repeat after me. We are gender neutral, because subatomic particles have no sexual gender, are invisible, and therefore do not and cannot pay taxes. Wow.
I am an electron and I'm okay.
I'm a robot and I'm okay.
All right, so thank you for that. And note until next week, if you have any comments that you would like to add to any of our stories, just scroll down to the bottom of the page and submit them there. All right, there have been several recent studies on the bodies of those members of the Lost Franklin expedition crew, which have been found. And those studies show high lead contamination. And it was long thought that lead poisoning led to the crew becoming deranged and making bad decisions. And it was thought high lead contamination came from the then new technology of soldering tinned food and from lead water pipes in the ships. Now, a Canadian university has studied lead levels from a piece of hair and discovered that, yes, they had lead levels, but it was not from being on board ship, but probably no higher than others in England at the time, and that lead poisoning was certainly not the sole cause of the crew's demise. I spoke to researcher Laurie D'Ortenzio at McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario, about the study, and in this excerpt she said why the university undertook the study, which was similar to what other studies have done.
Things have changed. We have much, much more sensitive instrumentation. I made sure that the hair was rigorously clean because we really wanted to make sure that there was no lead on the external surface of the hair. So we're very confident that our findings were what was in the blood at the time that the hair was growing. And so previous studies have said, yes, the lead was high, but some of them were higher than what we have found. And there's been another study published that agrees 100% with our findings from Western as well, that did bone and teeth. And they found that the lead levels were high because I think what happens is people haven't taken into account the fact that, in industrial Britain, everything was made of lead. They had lead tableware, there was lead in makeup, they put lead in all the medicines, their wine, their beer, their eating utensils, their drinking, everything, lead pipes. So a typical industrial British individual would have a much higher lead level. So the crew members walking onto the ship potentially had a much higher level lead burden than we would have today, or what would be acceptable today.
Roughly speaking, then, if you had a 20-year-old in Britain in the mid-1800s, how would that compare to the lead levels of a 20-year-old in modern Canadian society or British society, for that matter?
That's a really great question. I can tell you that in modern society, if your lead levels are anywhere approximately from 3 to 5 parts per mil, then that requires medical investigation. Whereas these lead levels were, 73 to 84. So by today's standards, they are high, absolutely. And they probably did have some, neurological effects. Therefore, they probably weren't making the best decisions. But you also have to add into the mix that they were starving. They probably had infection. They had all sorts of things going on that could have depressed their immune system. And that's what's different about this study. We didn't sort of make a blanket statement saying, oh, yes, they died of lead poisoning. We're saying that it was an exasperating factor, but it wasn't necessarily what actually killed them.
So what are we to understand about what happened to these guys then? If this was not the contributing factor, which has often been presumed previously,
yes.
What are we to take from your study then?
That it was a multitude of factors that killed them, exasperated by the lead. It was one of the contributing factors, but it definitely, we feel that it wasn't, they all did not die of lead poisoning per se, because they were exposed to a lot more lead than our societies would allow. Therefore, we're not sure if they adjusted to a higher lead burden.
Are there still things that we have yet to learn about what happened to the crew of this expedition?
Absolutely. I think the more research we do, the more we realize. I mean, this is one little piece of the puzzle. There's all sorts of things that are yet to be discovered.
And that was an excerpt of my conversation with Laurie D'Ortenzio at McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario, about their study into the fate of the lost Franklin expedition. Now, speaking of expeditions, we have with us once again, after a long, long absence, Marie-Claude Simard, and you had an interesting discovery on your trip abroad. So this has to do with prices, right?
Well, I had a wonderful trip to Scotland, and maybe I'll show you pictures next week and stuff like that. But I want to tell people, since I'm the web wizard here, to be careful when you buy your cheap plane tickets on travel website, because, well, everybody knows, but I wasn't careful, and that was basically the only glitch to my wonderful trip, was to find out that I had to pay $300, well, including both ways, for my check-in luggages. And I was sure I had, when I bought my ticket from a fare aggregator, like Flight Hub or cheap flights and stuff like that. I asked, and they said, yeah, but you can always make sure by phoning the company, and they gave me a phone number, and of course I called, and I was numbered 97 on the queue. So I hung up and I called again, then I tried to messenger them, and then I figured, well, she told me that I could check in, one luggage, and I got there, and no, I couldn't, so I had to pay each way like $150, and of course...
For one
So
luggage?
it was another fare for
luggage.
your suitcase.
Yeah.
One?
And,
So did it turn out to be cheaper than a regular price?
No, it was more expensive.
Oh.
So,
You thought you were getting a cheap flight?
My advice would be to make sure that you talk to the company when you actually pay your ticket, and have it printed that it says one allowed in, check-in luggage.
One suitcase,
Yeah.
Yeah, because I believe even some airlines are now charging for that first suitcase. The regular airlines used to get that free, and
no, that's it. There was no
Not even carry-on. They're charging for carry-on as well. It used to
they're
be,
talking
really?
about charging for carry-on now. Yeah, on Ryanair, namely.
Well, Ryanair, I don't think Ryanair charged for everything. They were the,
That's it.
They were the original.
Well, there's a lot of cheap, low-cost
It's okay if you're going, across the channel to Paris. No problem. You just need your backpack.
Well, anyway, that's all the time we have for the show for today, and we'll look forward to those pictures from your trip next time on The Link Online. And now for Carmel and for Terry and for Marie-Claude and Chantal and Pierre Dutil deep in the dark reaches of
Where is Dutil? Where is Dutil?
I'm Mark Montgomery. Take care until next week. Bye-bye. Which camera? I never know.
This one?
This one. Hey, there it is.
Bye.